Henry Schaefer is currently a professor emeritus of genetics, and my screen just shut off, that's great. Biomathematics at North Carolina State University, where he has worked since 1966. Henry served as the Associate Provost for Academic Computing from '84 to '93, and during that time he was one of the co-principal investigators for SURAnet, which we're going to hear about tonight. Glenn Rickard is an internet pioneer who implemented the first internet connection point, the FIX, in College Park, Maryland, and was recognized for this achievement by being inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame in August of 2013. Glenn was the principal investigator for SURAnet and the first regional, which was the first regional TCP/IP internet network for academic and commercial institutions. And finally, we have Dave Lambert, who has held a variety of leadership positions at Georgetown, Cornell, and Indiana University. He served as a SURA trustee and past chair of the SURA IT committee, and he became president and chief executive officer of Internet 2 in July of 2010. We are starting with an interesting thing. The titles you see up there are the titles at the time when this story begins. And with that, I'm going to give it to them and let them take over.
Okay. I'd like to start out mentioning, I've mentioned to a number of you, that my start in computing and networking was as a chicken farmer. And as a chicken farmer, later I wanted to be a chicken breeder, I learned the old riddle. Why did the chicken cross the road? You all know that. But why did the chicken cross the internet? To get to the other site. So I want to talk a little bit about how our group, SURAnet, started the internet. Notice my choice of words. Didn't say invented. We didn't invent the internet. The internet, you'll hear from one of the founders of that protocol with a video clip later tonight. We started it. We took what was there. We collaborated widely. None of us could have done it alone. None of us could have done it without the sponsorship of SURA and the help of the NSF and the institutions. We had 1 point per state. You'll see more of that. And so we together started the internet, and I'm going to turn this over at this point to Glenn, who's going to start back at day one, or a little bit before.
Or maybe a little bit before. Yes, as Henry just said, what SURA did was not to invent the internet, because Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn did that, but really we began to lay the beginnings of what is today's internet. The earlier things that happened, ARPANET, CSNet, those things have been taken apart. They no longer exist today. But the links that we established as part of SURAnet, are still in today's internet. So they are the oldest part of today's internet that have been continuously living from the time they were conceived, which we'll tell you about tonight, until today. So it's the oldest part of the SURAnet, of the internet. So the story starts with Harry Holmgren. Harry Holmgren is the first president of SURA, and I am the academic CIO at the University of Maryland at the time. And he said, Glenn, we're going to have a meeting in North Carolina, 1983, to get a supercomputer for the Southeast. These supercomputers are really important. We're also going after this, a continuous electron beam accelerator facility. We need to be able to reduce this data. And if we don't have something in the Southeast, we're going to have to put up with, they'll probably put one at MIT and Stanford, and we want to make sure something happens in the Southeast. So Harry brought me and other folks to North Carolina in October of 1983, and we had a meeting where we all talked about, could we have a supercomputer in the Southeast? Yes. Where exactly should it be? We're all going to agree on one. We're all going to get behind it. But of course, the rub was we couldn't decide exactly where in the Southeast it should be. There were many fine institutions, as there are today, competing. So after a 2-day meeting, there might be kind of failure at this meeting until another person here by the name of Jess Poor said, well, maybe we can't decide on a single computer for the Southeast. Maybe we'll get multiple computers. But whatever we do, we're going to need a network so that all of the SURA members can connect to the computers that do appear. So just change that dynamic. And by the way, Glenn Reichert should lead that effort. He had not consulted me in advance. This was a complete surprise. I had no idea. I'm kind of standing there. I'm sure I looked shell-shocked at the time. But the group said, this is a great solution, and then chartered the SURA Networking Committee to go and create a network. Between 1983 and 1985, we wrote proposals. They were not accepted by the National Science Foundation. In fact, the National Science Foundation didn't have any department or group to go fund them because there was no networking group at the National Science Foundation at the time. But we were the first group to think about doing a network in their part of the country. So of all the regional networks that exist, SURA was the first one to think about it beginning in 1983. So the SURAnet group came together. The three musketeers were myself, Henry Schaefer, and Morty Terragan. Morty is in Israel, couldn't join us tonight. And we got together and we wrote these proposals, and things were not being accepted. But we finally ended up with one where the NSF decided they did want to have a national effort called ScienceNet. And they said, why don't you propose to do ScienceNet? And we at SURA said, that would be very interesting. Could we get the entire country to convert to an unknown computer protocol using technical expertise that did not exist anywhere else except in maybe a few computer science departments at the time, and make that work? And we said, no, we really wanted to do the Southeast. And the NSF said, okay, we'll make a 3-tier system instead of a 2-tier system. Instead of being ScienceNet and campuses, we'll do ScienceNet, regional and state networks, and campuses. Make sense? So that was where the 3-tier networks began. And you can see here in the letter that was written to Billy Joe Wyatt at the National Science Foundation Committee for Advanced Scientific Computing. The economics of supercomputing is such that we need a network to be able to connect to all of these things. So we wrote another proposal in response to this call for a 3-tier network. And in this one, we had an executive summary that said U.S. productivity is tightly tied to the ideas that come from university research laboratories, and a computer communications network is a proven way to create new communities of interest and strengthen those groups which have already formed. Do you notice that we've already dropped the term supercomputer out of this summary here, at least the parts that I read? So we're beginning to think about this as a much more general science collaboration, academic collaboration network. And finally, in 1986, this is the happy letter. See, it's on National Science Foundation letterhead. In those days, it was typed with typewriters. Some of you remember those things. Since they didn't know what date they were actually going to send it out, that got stamped on. See the date stamped there? So on May 13th, 1986, this grant was given. Dear Dr. Holmgren, National Science Foundation hereby awards a grant to Southeastern Universities Research Association. So that is the beginning of the official NSF-sponsored SURAnet in May of 1986.
And I'd just like to add that not only was it not supercomputers, it was not only physicists and computer scientists. To quote from the grant proposal, it was for all scholars in all disciplines. And so this was the start of being much broader for all of our campuses and for everyone on the campus, as opposed to the specialization that we had at the beginning, which was only supercomputing.
Absolutely. So we're beginning to move this from a supercomputer network to a scholarship network, an academic network. And we began working with AT&T to provide 56 kilobit lines. Some of you may remember that now you can get 56 kilobits dial-up, but in those days 56 kilobits was quite a bit, faster than you could read even. So that began the first time that SURAnet began working with AT&T, and you're going to hear more of that story later. So we finally became live, and this is what we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of, the second or third week of January 1987. Second or third week of January 1987, we are live. It's the first two connections. It's College Park connecting to George Washington. We initially connected the physics departments and then, of course, the entire campuses. And we became the first, we became the first mid-tier network that became operational. So we're now just a bit ahead of NiserNet, which came shortly thereafter, I think only weeks afterwards, and other networks. Since we had such a large footprint, and this is the footprint that we chose, it was a political footprint with one institution in each state. So you can see LSU in Louisiana here, and you can see the other institutions that were connected at that time. The North Carolina folks got together and said, we'll connect to the Triangle University Computing Center, and then we'll all connect to it. So they ended up making an interesting choice there. But notice that there's also connections to, oh, I don't want that button. Is there a laser pointer here? Yes, somewhere. There it is. So to the John von Neumann Center, which is one of the supercomputer centers, to the Pittsburgh Supercomputer Center, Ralph Roskies and Mike Levine, and to the University of Illinois Center. The University of Illinois Center was notable because they created the web browser. So whenever you use a web browser, that was a creation of this particular NSF Supercomputer Center that we were connected to. And you can see that we had kind of this ring topology, so if any one link went down, most of the sites remained connected to each other. This is SURAnet just a little bit later, just a year later, in 1988. And you notice that a lot has been filled in already. It's made quite a bit of difference. This map shows 13 government agencies were now beginning to use SURAnet as their network to reach other government agencies. You had a question? No, okay. There was a wonderful hand gesture there as if there was an aha moment that had arrived. So you can see here, for example, the NIH, the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Bureau of Standards, the Department of Energy.
NCI of the top center.
NCI, Fox Chase Cancer Research Center, and of course the NSFNet backbone connecting to the other NSFNet supercomputer centers, NASA Goddard, and so forth. So at this stage, only a year after its inception, SURAnet is being used as the main agency to connect together other government agencies. They all connect to SURAnet and therefore get connected to each other. Why couldn't they just talk to each other directly? Well, how were they going to do that? None of them had a budget to connect to a different agency. They only had budgets for connecting their own agency. So how could they connect to each other? And the answer was, well, they could have a reason to go and connect to a SURA institution, and then that SURA institution would, by SURAnet, connect them to the other government agencies. And so this is how the SURA became the center of the internet at that time. Even the first commercial operators began by connecting their networks, the ones they were selling commercial time on, UUNet, PSINet, Bill Schrader, Rick Adams, connecting those to SURAnet so they would be connected to each other. So this time period, literally, we were the center of the internet for 2 years.
Yes, and part of it was that NSF does not want any of its money spent to subsidize commercial operations. And we negotiated with NSF a tricky way that none of their money went to anything commercial. It just went to your campuses to subsidize that. And so that was the start of the private-public coordination collaboration that, if you hear us use the word collaboration a lot tonight, it's because it was a collaboration.
And this connectivity of everybody else to SURAnet is still present in the DNA of the internet today. You'll see more interconnections happening in and around the SURA area than any other place because SURAnet was the interconnecting fabric. SURAnet was the backbone of what was then the internet for those few years. And even today you can see how it's built up on that. Here's a map that's just a little bit later in 1988. You can see some of the connections there. And again, we're getting more government and commercial connections that are being established. Here we are in 1990. You can see that there's already a robust state network happening in Florida, in Alabama. And you can see the network there in Louisiana is beginning to fill in. So we're beginning to see the beginnings of real state networking happening in 1990 and 91. And here in 1992, we had a rich set of 120 connections to SURAnet. On the map at the right of the DC area, all of the yellow highlighted nodes were government agencies. SURAnet became far and away the dominant ISP, or Internet Service Provider, for a number of commercial institutions as well as government institutions. Henry and I and Morty got together, I forget exactly what year it was, probably about '89, and said, will we take on fully commercial organizations directly into SURAnet? And we thought about that for a while, and I think it was you, Henry, who said that if we don't, they'll make their own internet. So we want to have a single internet, and the way to have a single internet would be to invite them to all connect to us. Mm-hmm. So we began having those commercial organizations and as you talked about earlier, this sustaining funding model to be able to make that happen.
And the benefit to us was economies of scale. And we had more clout to negotiate routes and so on. And we spent a lot of effort trying to keep the price of bulk interconnects down. And I think we succeeded.
I think so. Tell us more about that success, Henry.
That wasn't really in the script. but we negotiated to get bulk connections, and back in those days the telephone companies were not terribly willing to sell you bulk connections. They wanted you to pay by the bit. And we worked very hard. We got competing bids, and so we had AT&T, we had MCI, we got competing bids, and we kept on growing the network. And we kept on connecting into the states to the mid-level, to the state-level networks. And my campus, and I'm certain your campuses, went through throes of effort trying to connect all the departments, all the scholars into participating in the internet. And so, Glenn, how did it get started, though?
Well, I think I've covered that part, Henry, so I think that's actually you.
Is that me?
That's you.
Okay. Gee, I didn't note that. Okay. The growth of this was very interesting because we mentioned the inventors. They invented what went into the ARPANET, Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense, and only campuses that had DoD contracts could use it, and only those people in those areas could use it. And then we had CSNet, Computer Science Net, and that again was only the scholars in computer sciences, left everybody else out. The NSF-Net backbone, the backbone part, which was slated to be supercomputers only, and was the mid-level networks such as SURAnet and the others that came a little bit later, some a lot later, would work for all of the research, all of academic and research education, and it's kind of cute to do this as a gigabits per second number. I mean, even a few years later, the backbone of the NSF-Net wasn't quite as fast as what I have coming in to my home now. And it's just amazing. And mentioned this phrase before, that to me is perhaps one of our biggest innovations, not inventions, innovations, and it's collaborative. I'll go on to talk a little bit about first Vint Cerf. You'll hear from Vint in a minute.
On the next slide.
On the next slide. Hear from Vint, and he'll introduce himself, but he's the co-inventor of the TCP/IP protocol that is the basis of the internet. Everybody knows about Senator Al Gore, but what I did not know when I started working on this was that senators really don't work on the details. That's why they have staff. NSF didn't know if NSF-Net was going to be continued funding. They came to SURA. They said, we got this young junior senator from Tennessee who likes technology. Send somebody to go talk to him. I was the somebody. I went and I met Senator Gore, but I worked with Mike Nelson, who's had quite a career in networking. And all I can say is they worked, and they worked hard. Refunding was achieved, and by the next time it came up in the Congress, NSFNet was so popular, there was no need to worry.
I wanted to add that Al Gore came from the Sura region. So Al was a senator that we had connections to, that we had trustees who knew, and I think that was actually another part of the success that happened there.
Probably, yes. But the point is, that was a juncture when funding was uncertain, and you all have lived through funding uncertainties, and it worked. And we got funded, and we continued.
So we invited Vince Cerf to come and talk to you tonight. And he would love to have done so, but he had another commitment. But he did record a message for us. He was at his hotel in London, as you'll hear.
Hello, my name is Vince Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and sometimes known as one of the fathers of the Internet. I'm sorry that I can't join you in person to celebrate the 30th anniversary of SURAnet. I'm sure you're scratching your head just like I am, wondering where those decades went. But SURAnet had a very important role to play in the story of the Internet. It was one of the intermediate level networks that was created in conjunction with the NSFNet backbone, a clever tactic to avoid having the NSFNet team have to deal, directly with 3,000 different universities. So SURAnet was also a very important training ground for some of our most accomplished internauts. One name which immediately comes to mind is Jack Waters, who eventually worked at MCI in my engineering department and then went on to work at Level 3 as its Chief Technology Officer. I think that we owe a great deal to NSF in particular for architecting this particular way of implementing Internet, to say nothing of the many people who have gone on to careers in Internet-related activity who got their early training in one or another of the intermediate level networks of the NSFNet system. So again, I'm sorry to say that I can't be with you in person, but I shall raise a glass on the day celebrating the role of SURAnet and its 30th anniversary.
This now typifies the use of the Internet by different fields. And so I'll start out by talking about Grace Hopper, who I knew. At the end, she was Admiral Grace Hopper, but she was one of the pioneers. Since we earlier heard about COBOL, she was one of the people who pushed the development of COBOL when it was brand new. And she represents the computer scientists who really were pushing at the beginning for the use of the Internet.
The next discipline after computer science to really use what was becoming the Internet that we started were, of course, physicists, because there were a lot of physicists in Sura at the time. So physics became the second discipline after computer science to really begin using the network.
And then one of the early participants were the libraries. And we typify that with Cliff Lynch, who was a digital librarian. He was the guy who handled the University of California system online catalog, and he worked with Sura to make that available to people outside of California. And he had a little fight on his hands. Why should California support anything that's not in California? Well, he won the fight, and that really helped bring library resources onto the Internet.
And then, of course, we saw every other discipline on campus come and join. Business, philosophy, chemical engineering, everybody else came on board. My favorite is one of my friends, Ron Weissman there, who's on the right. He's an Italian Renaissance historian. And he immediately brought the Italian Renaissance, began digitizing it, began looking at 3D models, began cataloging everything. And it became part of the digital humanities revolution. So that was perhaps the last piece to come in, but still not very many years behind the original starting of the Internet. So supercomputer access and research access that had been established by 86, 87 included the NSFNet backbone that you see here. This is the national backbone that connected SURAnet together with MidNet, BarNet, the JVNCNet, the NearNet, which was the Northeast Academic Regional Network. And so now the network is beginning to be taken for granted, and the Sura collaboration becomes really critical because it's really the academic collaboration that this is enabling, right? It's not just you can send email. You can send an idea. You can send a preprint. You can send a, let's work together on this document. And
A manuscript.
all of these things are beginning to happen for the first time in many fields. So collaboration created SURAnet, which created a collaborative tool for every discipline on campus. And I'd like to turn it over to Dave to tell you a bit more about the story.
Next slide
Advance it twice.
to get to the timeline. Yeah. Okay. So I will pick up the story here. As so many of you know, being part of part of universities and the world that involves our federal government often gets kind of rocky. And so where the story goes here now is that one of the greatest successes that I think higher education's ever had in IT, and that was the spawning of the internet, okay, which was this extraordinary accomplishment, and what the team of folks in SURAnet and other parts of the country that worked on this brought about was extraordinary. But it also, and this beginning of the commercialization of the internet, then began to kind of eat some of the successes that we had had. And so we began to see this tension with the creation of the early, what were called internet service providers, the two most important ones of which emerged from the SURA region and the New York region with NYSERNet, UUNet and PSI. It began to become clear that the commercial internet, along with a commercial provider like AOL, was really going to become a significant point of commerce. And so there began this process that got very political, where there was pressure coming from this growing commercial community to push NSF out of the funding business for networking because they saw a commercial opportunity, and they saw NSFNet and they saw the state and regional networks as no longer facilitators, but as potential impediments to the development of the commercial network. And so we saw this period of about 2 years in 93, 94, 95, when there was an enormous amount of commercial pressure for NSF to withdraw from the networking business, which they were forced to do. It was a great success in the sense that we now had a commercial marketplace that was providing these services, but at the same time, we learned very early on in that process that the commercial community was going to focus on residential access, on commodity access, and our community that was used to these very high-speed network connections was now living in a world where, utilizing the commercial providers, we couldn't even begin to do the kinds of things that we had been doing for some time. And so we were at this point where something had to change. And there were a couple of sort of NSF facilitated transitional projects, but as we fast forward to 1996, a group of university CIOs met in Chicago, had as a part of a long conversation where we decided that if higher education was going to be able to continue to benefit from advanced networking, which we clearly were with these research collaborations across all our fields, that there were two things we knew. Number one, we could never reliably depend on the federal government to operate a network in the political context of the United States, at the same time that in Europe and other countries they were moving deeper, into that. And number two, our needs were always going to be ahead of the commercial community. And so we created a new project called Internet 2, and I'm not here to talk a lot about Internet 2, but as part of that process of commercialization and this sense that we could depend on the commercial community, the energy went out of the state and regional networks. And in fact, several of the state and regional networks actually were bought, and their assets were bought by these startup commercial providers. SURAnet was one of them. NYSERNet had a commercial spinoff. BARNet had sold itself. MidNet sold itself. And so we found essentially the commercial providers weren't providing the support, and the regional ecosystem, which had built up around the supercomputer centers, was losing its energy. And so we had to go somewhere. And what that meant for the SURA region, and so in 1995, SURA was sold.
SURAnet.
And and several of these SURAnet was sold, several of these commercial transactions occurred, and Internet 2 was sort of born. The problem being that Internet 2 was built to be a national project. It really didn't have the resources to reach back into the regions. And so the very first thing that began then to become the focus of what SURAnet had to deal with was the fact that we had a national project, we had a new national network in Internet 2, but with the end of SURAnet, we no longer had the last mile infrastructure that allowed us to get the universities to the national network. And that's about the time frame when I started working with Gary. We were both sort of refugees from SURAnet at that time point, to begin to say, okay, what is the role of SURA here? Do we build another SURAnet? Do we build another SURAnet? Or do we focus on, since we've got the national network, we should probably focus on facilitating the recreation of these state and regional network entities. And so in a short-term period, the SURA IT Committee and SURA sort of became the laboratory for the creation of a set of next-generation state networks, which flourished in the SURA region at a rate that was much greater than in much of the rest of the country. And you saw Mid-Atlantic Crossroads in the Mid-Atlantic area, you saw SOX in Atlanta, you saw FLR, you saw Learn in Texas, you saw, for those of you from Louisiana, the creation of the Louisiana State Network that became a major partner of the Internet 2 project, as did all of these projects. Then there was sort of a second, and so the real focus then of SURA became, how do we strengthen the state network ecosystem? Then there was sort of a second phase of this, where we saw this very significant change. The first NSFnet had been a managed network. It was provided by a supplier. The first Internet 2 network was actually a managed network provided by Quest. But what was going on in that same time was the telecom explosion. And companies were building fiber optic networks all over the country. But then, as you recall, that hit a cliff and in fact fell off the cliff. And this big argument, very positive argument at most of the time, emerged in our community about, is this an opportunity for research and education to get their hands on optical capacity? And so we had this period when there was sort of a division of perspective in the community. Let's get our services from the commercial community versus let's get down to the bottom of this. Let's get optical network capacity and let's build our own networks on top of it. And SURA became, I think, one of the 2 or 3 national leaders in the movement toward acquisition of dark fiber. And the SURA state networks turned their attention toward actually, in this period, acquiring dark fiber, some very attractive rates. And in fact, SURA was able to negotiate an extraordinary deal as a result of relationships that had been built up that involved the donation of 6,000 miles of optical fiber to the R&E community by a traditional provider, AT&T, that became a very, very important piece of the transition from managed network services to owned optical network services. And the role that SURA played there continues to live, honestly, until this day. The next kind of inflection point, though, was with the regional networks rebuilt, with Internet 2 built, and with what we called National Lambda Rail, which was the optical alternative until the whole thing came back together again in about 2010, we could then really turn our attention to what do we do with this network. And so the focus then for SURA IT turned to what do we do and how can we facilitate the ability of the Southeastern universities and the SURA members to be at the forefront of the deployment of a lot of application-level capabilities across this network infrastructure, working with partnerships with major providers, with IBM, Dell, Microsoft, working with universities on innovative projects in supercomputing with Blue Waters, in the early distribution of video across the network with the V-Day project, and working with the coastal ocean community in SURA to assure that that research was taking advantage of the capability that exists. So new uses for new networks, and in fact, then the beginning of the expansion beyond sort of, we always called them R&E networks, but the R was always this big and the E was this big. And that began to change as SURA began to focus on how do we raise the size of the E. You know, how do we push this to minority serving institutions? You know, how do we use this infrastructure you know, to actually support the work of sciences? And so these projects then became the center point of what SURA was focused on. All made possible because of the network, things from incident response to cybersecurity to big data projects that became projects spread across the SURA region, now because the southeastern region had as good as, if not back in the position of having as advanced infrastructure as any other part of the R&E networking community. Glenn.
So the collaborative spirit that started SURAnet, that created collaboration among all of the academics, that started really what we have been thinking about as the starting of today's internet. We have a couple of folks here today who were present at the very beginning. Mike Petrie, where are you? Could you stand up, please? Mike was one of the original folks, developers in SURAnet, and also for the NSFNet backbone, that connecting together all of the regional networks. Mike was one of the folks who worked on the software that made all of that work. And we had two other PIs for SURAnet join us, Bud Suddeth, who is no longer with us, but also Ron Hutchins. Ron, would you stand up, please? Ron is right over here. And Ron was also of significant guidance to making that project successful. Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you very much, Mike. So this collaborative spirit made a very big difference, and I'd like to just talk about how that is today. Here is the SURA region today. SURA institutions are among the best connected institutions anywhere in the world because so much of the internet is here. So for example, 62% of all of the Google data centers are in the SURA region, in this colored region on the map. 50% of all the Facebook data centers, including their largest data center, is here. More than 50% of Amazon's capacity, including their largest single data center, is in the SURA region. And the reason that they've put these data centers in the SURA region is because of the great connectivity that grew up around what SURA initially started in SURAnet. This was a fantastic advantage, and that means our campuses have the most direct connections to cloud computing. They're closest to us, there's fewer paths for failure, we get better response time from the clouds in the southeast than anyone else gets in the United States, or I would even say across the world. So this is really something that's a legacy of SURAnet and our direct access. Every business that uses the cloud in the southeast region also benefits because they have that same kind of close to the cloud, close to the data center access because of these centers growing up in the SURA region. And that's a very significant impact. And of course, it's not just in our region, it's the impact of SURAnet is felt internationally. You can see here a map of international connections. And you can see that the United States has just become the interconnection hub for the entire world. I should note that SURA made the very first connections to 3 countries in the southeast, in South America. They connected to Brazil and Argentina and to Chile. Those connections were made from SURAnet to those other countries. And the global internet is now a 4-tier structure. We now have a global interconnect structure. That 4th tier is what you see here on the screen. But when you consider all of the traffic globally across these links, more than 70% transits the SURA region. And that's because of the original interconnect points that I showed you in those earlier maps. And they've just been built on and built on. So today, 70+% of all worldwide internet traffic flows through the SURA region. And that means really superior direct access to scientific instruments, no matter what country they're located in, wherever the square kilometer array is built, the Atacama Desert for telescopes. All of those scientific instruments have very direct connections to SURA institutions because of that legacy of having started SURAnet and being the first organization to really interconnect all of those things. And remember, we started this as a supercomputer effort. Remember I told you about October '83? We were seeking a supercomputer for the Southeast. We've won. There are 21 supercomputers in the Southeast now, including 2 here in Louisiana and one at CBAF that needs, at JLab that needs a name, by the way. So we need a naming, Allison tells me that we need a naming contest for the machine at JLab. And in fact, the fastest supercomputer in the United States, the fastest supercomputer in the United States is the Titan supercomputer that you see pictured here at Oak Ridge National Laboratories.
Scale coming.
So guess what? SURA has within its region the fastest supercomputer in the United States. So I wanted to thank the trustees very much for going with and investing in SURAnet since 1983, 34 years ago.
Stand next to him.
It's really a very significant thing. We thank you very much. I think it's made a big difference. It's made a difference to SURA, to the SURA institutions, to the states in SURA, to the economic development of the states in which our institutions thrive, and in fact to the country and to the world. It's made a very significant difference there. And this is something that is not of importance just to us, but the difference is being felt by current researchers coming into the field that take this for granted, not even realizing how it was started. But it's something that we as SURA need to be telling our successors, our sons, our daughters, our grandsons and granddaughters, how the internet as we now know it came to be. It was really very significant. And at the time that we started SURAnet, the trustees will remember this was a bit of a speculative venture. Harry Holmgren used quite a bit of his personal political value to say, we really need to go and do this new thing called SURAnet. And not everyone was convinced, but a lot of people did take the leap. So I'd like to continue to ask you, all three of us would like to continue to ask you, to be able to seek out those bold and brave ideas. For those bold and brave ideas are really the ability to have the new limitless possibilities that are going to create something new. And I also want to encourage you to embrace the uncertainty that's present, because from uncertainty, we see the cradle of new innovation. And collaboration remains a central value to SURA, to this team, and we want to encourage that collaboration to remain in place because that was a key message, a key thread that ran through all of this. And as Ken Blanchard has said, none of us are as smart as all of us. So for Henry, myself, and David, thank you very much for your attention this evening. It's been great telling you the story.
Thank you.